You know what the magic word, the only thing that matters in American sexual mores today is one thing. You can do anything. The left will promote and understand and tolerate anything as long as there is one element. Do you know what it is? Consent.
Well, yeah, Rush. So I was DMing this game, and the group of plucky adventurers were rescuing a blacksmith from a group of marauding goblins under the control of a pair of bugbears. The bugbears were an evil married couple, not that the players knew that was my headcanon, who recruited this group of desperate goblins to work for them as they performed a ritual to appeal to their evil god. Well, the heroes went through the dungeon, room by room, evading traps, solving riddles, gathering toenails. Toenails are goblinoid currency in my world. Ew. So they use the currency to bribe the goblins to join their side. The party finds the bugbear couple just before the ritual is complete. The husband bugbear charges at the party with a giant cleaver, while the wife sorceress attempts to complete the ritual. She holds the sacrificial knife over the blacksmith. After a heroic battle, and sadly the deaths of a few goblins, the party has captured the surrendering bugbear sorceress. In a flash, one of the players states that he's going to strip the bugbear naked. I take a quick glance at the players, and there's a general look of confusion, especially among the women in the group. It was a fast-paced moment. The players were just happy to have won, and people were talking about what they were doing very, very quickly. It was a slip. But I had already established the do's and don'ts in our game, so we corrected the moment and moved on. Role-playing games are unpredictable. That's part of the fun, but that's also a danger of the game. The open-ended nature of a tabletop RPG allows for situations where anything can happen. With that, you have to ensure that everyone is on the same page. Otherwise, you can run afoul of ruining someone's game. Consent can be expressed via oral or written agreement. Can be implied, especially if it is ordinarily and reasonably to be contemplated as incidental to the activity in question. Now, when a person steps into the boxing ring, you cannot complain about getting punched in the face. The act of entering the ring is implicit acceptance of hands being thrown at your face. Now, it seems pretty obvious that in a boxing ring, you know what that entails. Upon initial thought, you may think that your role-playing game is the same way. Goblins and orcs, combat and traps, magic and spells. But role-playing games are as varied as the groups that play them. I've been in my share of gaming groups, and no two campaigns, even with the same group, plays the same. There are varying themes and ideas that you may want to explore in your game, both as a player and as a game master. With that level of freedom, you cannot implicitly consent to much, even in a game with a seemingly direct theme. Does sexism exist in your world? What about racism, colorism, transphobia, homophobia? I've sometimes heard that these are a given because that's how it was back then. But this is a fictional world that you have created. So the history of social issues in your world don't necessarily need to follow what exists in the real world. But hey, I hear you say, if that is the case, why are you so mad about creatures being offensive to you because of real-world racism if it's dependent on your world building? When I discuss the effects of racist tropes in entertainment, it's actually different than racist themes being discussed in a work of art. For instance, racism is the very subject matter of a movie like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. You know that when you watch that movie, racism is going to be dealt with. However, you can state that racism doesn't exist explicitly in a movie like Gone with the Wind. But racism is in the tropes and in the nature of the depiction in that film. And if you use those tropes and caricatures, but change the names to make a fantasy version, you're still using harmful stereotypes, just with a different coat of paint. And that does not make that okay. Even away from social issues, do you have other things that may disturb people in your game? When describing combat, Do you get into the blood, gore, graphic depictions of torture? Do children get hurt? Do you depict mental issues within your game? Any NPCs commit self-harm? Content warning, horror, and zombies. I love zombie movies. I love the social commentary. I love the idea of having a group of people work together and having intrasocial conflicts. I also like watching people get eaten. That scene in every zombie movie where they linger on someone who just gets caught by the zombie hordes is something I love. There's probably something wrong with me, but not everybody shares my glee at that level of gore. So, if there's a combat situation, I don't just automatically go into a description of some intensely graphic violence, unless I know that that's what my group wants. While I am usually the first person to extol the virtues of allowing player freedom in a game, there are things in my game that I do not accept, things that I'm not comfortable with. In the example I gave at the start, I had a discussion with that group that sexual violence is not something I allow in games that I participate in. So, when the moment happened, we simply said no and moved on. So having explicit consent, especially written down, is very useful for a gaming group. Why written? So that people have a reference for the future. You may have had that discussion with your group. Then 8 months and 3 levels later, look folks, sometimes I forget to do that milestone leveling, okay? Someone in the group might actually slip up and cross the line. Not because they're trying to be edgy or malicious, but because they forgot about it. It's hard to remember everything that might bother someone, especially in the heat of the moment in a role-playing session. Having a written cheat sheet to review every few weeks could be helpful to prevent accidental line crossing, because regardless of your intent, your actions in a role-playing game might trigger someone. Triggering. Back in 1998, Steven Spielberg released the seminal World War II film, Saving Private Ryan. After a brief prologue, the audience is thrown into a 24-minute scene of the most realistic depiction of warfare then put to film. Veterans at the time discussed how it brought back memories of the trauma and actually led some of them to seek treatment at VA hospitals.
The first half hour of the film is a graphic and ghastly recreation of the D-Day assault on Omaha Beach. Yet despite the warnings, many who went to the film's first showings this weekend were stunned. Many of those most affected by the scenes of D-Day are men who were actually on the scene that day.
The most realistic war movie I ever saw. People were being blown apart. People were dying.
Joe Camera was so distressed by the film that he had a recurrence of the shell shock he's suffered since 1944 and went to a VA hospital for treatment. The Veterans Administration is so concerned that the film will trigger flashbacks in other veterans that it is manning a 24-hour hotline for those traumatized by the film.
Even then, over 20 years ago, they were referring to it as triggering. Psychologists in the United States have been studying this type of provocation of trauma since the Civil War. The term trigger was utilized for World War I veterans since the 1930s to indicate the effect that something may have in provoking trauma to resurface in a person. Primarily, it is related to something that causes a post-traumatic response in someone. That isn't limited to just combat veterans, but any sort of trauma that a person could have faced. Trigger warnings were not popularized until the early 2000s internet culture as a way to give a person a heads up if something might trigger a post-traumatic response. You see it used in phobic responses as well. I am unsure why people have such a negative view of this term. Like many terms, it's used outside of its normal context, and perhaps overused. But language is about conveying understanding. Getting consent in gaming is something that prevents triggers. When I confirm that someone in my game doesn't want to play with extreme violence, sexual assault, racism, or something else that can bring about a traumatic or phobic response, I am making sure that my game is safe for them to play. And that may seem like an odd concept. Safe game. Games are supposed to be fun, but if you brush against someone's trauma, even inadvertently, it isn't fun for them. You might not know what that trauma is. I know veterans who were triggered by Saving Private Ryan. I know veterans who were not. I know non-veterans who were triggered by that movie. The existence of veterans who were not affected by the scene does not prohibit the existence of non-veterans who were. So you may not know what traumas or phobia a person brings to your table, and it may not be your business to have your player or game master explain their trauma to you. But if you know that there is a subject that you should probably avoid, then at least you have that information moving forward. And if you feel that it is essential to your game, at least everyone knows beforehand to prevent any issues. My home game has racism in it. I have commented before about how this interests me to investigate the subject in the context of a role-playing game. But if I have a player that's uncomfortable with it, I could either ask them not to participate in the game, especially if the other players wanted to explore that subject, or I could just remove it from my game. In either instance, you're avoiding the potential for a triggering moment. Explicit consent. Consent needs to be an explicit opt-in procedure. We live in a society. Sorry, couldn't help it. We live in a society where trauma is viewed as weakness. This creates a twofold problem of the illness and the stigma. Knowing this, it is sometimes too much to have someone admit to having an issue with something. In this, you must frame the consent as affirmative. Engage in the things that people really want to engage in. This makes it not just a list of things to avoid in your game, but also things you can lean into during the game. This is a two-pronged tool for the game master. You know what to avoid, and you know what your players want. Maybe they love horror elements with zombies, and now you have an idea of what to provide them. You might have me in your group as a player, in which case, somebody, even if it's my character, better get eaten, if everyone is on board with that as a possibility. It isn't just about safeguarding people's emotional state, though that is the most important thing. It is also about knowing what your players or game master want out of the game. Now, it is vitally important to ensure that in an RPG setting, you have the consent of your players. There's a pretty famous example of this happening in an online tabletop role-playing game where, at the time, a rather prominent GM introduced a sexual assault element into one of his games, and the results were terrible.
Don't be scared. I've done it before. I can show you. And he reaches over onto the table and he picks up some kind of like device, right? It's got a plug on one end and some buttons on the handle. And he says, I'm going to do it real gentle the first time and you tell me how it feels, okay? And
sure.
he says there's a port in the back of your neck. You can feel it. And he gently, like, he puts his hands up like you're a scared animal. He's like, let me just, and he reaches up to touch it, right? And you can feel it. There's a port back there. And it's like, as far as you know, it's like a firmware update port. It's hidden at the base of your skull. You don't remember, like, it's never been accessed while you were conscious. So he reaches up, you can feel it, and he holds up the device, and you can see that the prongs on the thing match the feeling of the plug. And he says, I'm just a little at first, okay?
You can see the look on the person's face while this is happening to her character. You can see the faces of the other players around the game and their shock at what is just happening. Now, the person involved here, they never consented to this type of activity inside of their game, and as a result, they chose to quit, and the entire show was canceled. This is how important it is to ensure that you have the consent of the people involved. You're trying to avoid trauma. We're trying to create a safe space for people to have fun. Something that you may find very interesting may not be what the players are looking for. And you need to know that before you engage in this type of behavior. This was unacceptable. Now, I don't know any of the people involved in this personally. I don't know what traumas this may have brought up. But it doesn't matter what group you're playing with. You have to ensure that you have the consent of the parties before introducing this type of element into your game. And as I said previously, I would never introduce this type of element into a game I'm participating in. It's too hurtful for too many people. Resources. So I've included some things in the down below that can assist you with this in your game. You will find a link to Monte Cook's Consent in Gaming worksheet and pamphlet, both of which are free to download PDFs. You can use the worksheet as a handout to your players or game master to ensure that everyone is playing the game that they want to play and getting the experience that they're looking for. And you can expand upon it to include topics that you want to see if they want to explore in your game, outside of the issues like trauma. Like, do you want a political intrigue game or more of a hack and slash, grid-based combat, or theater of the mind? There are editable spots to add what is pertinent so that it can be a one-stop shop for you. If you found this useful, please be sure to like the video. This channel spreads purely by word of mouth, so it is so helpful for you to share it, retweet it, and spread it around social media. For more content like this, please be sure to subscribe. Hit that bell icon so you're notified when a new video drops, which is about every 2 weeks at this point. I love engaging with you guys in the comments section. We're still small enough that it's mostly just great people having a good conversation. Please be friendly down there. If you have any suggestions for a future video, please let me know. And as always, roll dice, roll play, and roll with it. Go. A little faster, man.